Well, what are the challenges for human resources managers as we end this year? To talk about that, I'm joined by Paul Falcone. He is the author of the Paul Falcone Workplace Leadership Series, and he's also a consultant. Paul, thank you so much for joining me today.
No, my pleasure. So happy to be here, Linda.
There's so many issues to talk about when we talk about HR and the challenges. But first, give us a little bit about your background, how you ended up being a consultant on this, and what your background that led you to this is.
Yeah, it's interesting. I spent about 3 decades in the HR trenches. I was head of HR for Nickelodeon Animation, head of international HR for Paramount Pictures. I was with that company, Viacom, the parent company, for about a decade. I've also worked in healthcare and biotech, as well as financial services. So I've been through the union, nonprofit, international, you name it, I pretty much touched it. And that's funny because I was writing at the same time that I was in those HR roles. And what happened for me, Linda, is my writing kind of informed my career path. I wanted to make sure I touched enough of these industries to be able to write about it. And thankfully, the companies where I worked were very supportive of my writing. So my 17th book just came out with HarperCollins in May, just a few months ago. And it's been keeping me mighty busy for these last couple of decades, but I've been having a lot of fun with it.
Well, there's a lot to think about when we think about the future of work and what HR departments should be doing to get everybody ready for that. But first, I wanted to ask this kind of general question. If you look at workers right now and you look at workplaces, what would you say the state of things is? Because we've come through a lot.
Yeah, employers are very worried about worker burnout. Employers are worried about that. They should be. Employers are worried about Gen Z, the millennia, the Zoomers, the 25 and under crowd, because they are testing out as the loneliest, the most isolated, the most depressed generational cohort on the planet. So we hear a lot about mental wellness and well-being in the workplace, and we should, because it's a real concern. The burnout is real. We're coming out of COVID where people, again, if however you count it, 2 to 3 years of COVID is going to take at least 5 years to kind of get back a balance. And we faced so much in terms of building the plane while flying it, the exhaustion that went into that, especially if you were in healthcare or something that directly was touched by the COVID pandemic. And I just think even if you weren't, companies are very schizophrenic these days. They can't find enough people 1 month. 6 months later, they're laying off. The job market freezes up. Then, the cycles are a lot shorter. So this idea of leading through crisis, leading through disruption, that's a muscle we have to build because I don't think it's going to slow down anytime soon. I think we just have to kind of face that that's our new normal. And that's the way we have to reinvent the workplace going forward.
It's interesting, Paul, because I started this podcast in 2020 and I interviewed a lot of people who were managing in 2020, 21, 22. And I have a lot of respect for them because they were asked to do things they weren't trained to do, right? And they had to just keep figuring it out as things changed. So they did a lot, and now we're kind of in a different phase. And at the same time, the workers did a lot too, because they were constantly having to change things, constantly challenged. So if I ask you now, who is more stressed? The people doing the managing and making the decisions or the workers? Which one would you say?
My answer to that would be yes, which is the political answer. I think everyone feels it, but the managers feel it more. And I'll tell you why. It's hard enough to be an individual contributor when the work demands are through the roof. But when you're a manager, when you're in a leadership role, you have to tend to the sheep, so to speak. You're still an individual contributor. You still have your own deliverables. But on top of that, you have to make sure your people are feeling engaged and they're doing their best work every day with peace of mind. And they're giving discretionary effort. And they're at the top of Maslow's hierarchy and all this stuff. It's hard for managers. My audience for writing has always been frontline operational leaders because that's the culture of your company, but that's really where the rubber meets the road. And again, most haven't gotten the kind of training they need to become excellent people leaders, even if they have an MBA from a top 10 school. They don't teach leadership in the trenches. They teach organizational design and organizational behavior and these 30,000-foot concepts, but they're not teaching you how to be a great leader, how to hold a tough conversation, how to motivate your people and make them want to do things, not because they have to, but because they want to. And I think in a way, that's where my books have kind of filled a niche. I didn't know it while I was writing them as I look back, but it's like teaching them the how of how to become a great leader is really where I think the most important messages can get out.
Do you talk to people in HR as well as through organizations?
Sure. Yeah,
Okay, so do
absolutely.
you think they're on the same page? Because sometimes I think the C-suite is saying one thing and HR leaders are saying something else, and people in the front lines are saying something else.
Yeah, that level of asymmetrical conversation or not being in alignment is real. And the easiest way to look at it is with remote work. I mean, Linda,
For
we
sure.
went from you can't work at home to everyone must work at home. You're not allowed onto the workplace unless you have a specific letter of, from the company saying you're you're a required worker who must come in. Shy of that, you're not allowed to come in. And we found new technology like Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Google Meets, which I hadn't heard of in 2020. And all of a sudden we talked about Zoom fatigue. So it was just in time technology, which really helped. But now we're to a point where as we emerge from this pandemic, as we continue through this reintegration phase, guess what? CEOs have what's called, they call it productivity paranoia. They can't see what their people are doing, and it's hard to manage the unseen. So a lot of CEOs want people back as if COVID never happened. Well, here's the problem with that. When you look at Gen Y millennials, 45 and under, Gen Z Zoomers, 25 and under, they're the most studied generational cohorts in world history. We know everything about them, thanks to the think tanks and the universities and everybody else. And one of the things they wanted pre-COVID was a better sense of work, life, family, balance, control, equilibrium, whatever you want to call it. That preceded the pandemic. For many of them now, the workers are feeling like, look, I can get the work done. I don't have to commute every day. And boy, this is great. So why should we have to go back? Why should I even have to do hybrid? Right now, from what I'm seeing out there, Linda, most companies are on about a 3 days a week schedule of back at work every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, that sort of thing. In the new year, I expect companies to push that to 4 days. In most of the CEO surveys I've read, they're thinking by the end of 2026, most people will be back at work full-time, 5 days a week. But you don't know that yet. And the reality is talent scarcity is a challenge, and that's a big challenge for HR. And so, you can't go too fast on putting your foot on the gas when the employees are putting their foot on the brake because they're going to leave and they're going to go elsewhere. Yet, CEOs are also worried about lack of teamwork, lack of camaraderie, right? What about collaboration? What about creativity and innovation? Where does that go when people aren't sitting side by side? And boy, a lot of these younger kids, they don't have, friends. They don't have people to look up to, role models. They really need to be here for their own good. That reality is good. But the workers are also saying, but we can do this on a balance. It doesn't have to be an all or none. And you're going to see this continue to struggle. This balancing of what needs to be on site versus what needs to be remote or can be done in a hybrid format is something that I think we all have to live with. I think that's a real reality for HR to be able to shepherd moving forward, to find a balance that's going to work in every company, but a little bit differently in each company.
Yeah, one of the interesting things to me, Paul, is that there is no consensus, right? You still have some companies who say it's better not to have everyone here. We don't want to pay the real estate costs. We can make it work. You have others where the CEO is adamant and, this is not something that can work. We can never be a winner. We need everybody back. And you have years where we're going to look at economic cycles. And my background is an economist, basically. If we have this year, Federal Reserve cuts rates and we have a boom, workers are going to have a lot more ability to decide where they go, right?
Correct.
So, it really depends. Or if there's a recession, they won't. How many years of back and forth do we get before we get a consensus?
4.2. No, I'll tell you. Here's a scoop, Linda, and you bring up such good stuff. There's a book that I rely on a lot, and it's called The Next 100 Years by George Friedman, who's also an economist. It was a New York Times bestseller. It came out in 2009. And I talk about that book a lot because it was pre-pandemic, obviously, but he talks about what are the massive global trends happening for the rest of the century. One of the big issues is talent scarcity. In the industrialized countries, there's just not enough people to do the work. China's one baby per family child went on for far too long. South Korea has the lowest birth rate on the planet. Japan has 125 million residents. By 2050, it's going to be 88 million. The average age is going to be over 65. Who's going to do the work? And these trends are happening in all the global economies, not just the United States, but the broader economies out there that are successful economies. I think employers would be smart to look at this and say, we need to look at where the tea leaves are telling us to go. It's not going to be all about talent acquisition. Talent acquisition is great when you can get it. It's going to be about talent development. You got to
Okay.
grow your own. And you need to know how to grow talent, to move through the ranks in your organization, because you may not have the luxury of simply posting something on LinkedIn or running an ad on Indeed.com and having all the fish jump in the boat. It may not work like that. The talent scarcity we've seen as part of this COVID emergence period is the rest of the century. It's not just now. COVID is just shining a light on it.
Okay, I don't disagree. However, I look at these two. And the other part of this is AI, right? Technology in general, but certainly AI. And I won't say which will be the bigger impact because we don't completely know yet. My question is just how equipped are HR departments to deal with this and put together a plan for integrating AI over the next however many years?
It's in its nascent stages. HR people are not trained in data analytics, and this is not kind of, they're not math majors as a rule, not always. Compensation people certainly can be, but overall, when you look at the HR practice, these are not people who are deep dive data miners. The reality, though, is data analytics, this idea of metrics and looking at your people almost as an asset. Like, what is this asset doing? CEOs are realizing for the first time, our most important asset really is our people. They're not just paying lip service to that. It's like they realize that your most important asset goes home at night and may not come back tomorrow morning. They're tired of being ghosted by candidates who don't come in, candidates who don't show up on the first day of work and orientation when they're supposed to be there, or candidates who come in and 60 days later they quit because some other company they were interviewing with 3 months ago, the same time they were interviewing with you, finally came in with their offer. They took you as the safe place, but they knew they were going to go to that other company. It's very frustrating for employers. And I think the reality is where HR is going to start building more certifications is learning about AI. And the AI is going to touch everything from the recruitment piece to the training and development piece to the uh, uh, just everything. I mean, everything we touch. I'm not just talking about efficiency. I'm talking about really being able to trace what are Paul Falcone's skills and what is his background and what are his experiences, things they may not show up on my resume or on my employment application. Can you find a way to build this digital footprint around each of your employees that talks about where their potential strengths lie and what they're passionate about? Harvard Business Review, in their book Performance Management, talks about, you know, what is it that this profile looks like of what are the things that drive most people? And to the degree that you, as a smart employer, can sit back and look at this stuff and say, okay, I think, Paul, let me meet with you. If you look at these 8 things, what are the ones that motivate you? And how can we tie some of your goals to some of these things that match your personal interests? How can you grow in your career? How can I help you get there while you're here in our company? That's really where a lot of it's going to go, Linda. We're just touching this. It's a whole new invention of HR. Historically, HR was seen as more of an administrative task. 50 years ago, when it was kind of coming into its own, people saw it as the check the box department when it was still personnel. But now, if you're thinking that the human capital element, so to speak, the primary profit driver, the lever is your people, who's the shepherd of the people? That's where HR has its chance to really shine. And I think there's a bright future for the function.
Well, I have to think that there's going to be different skills demanded of HR as well.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And you're going to see it in the form of the certifications that are being offered. We're for the first time seeing courses being offered, certifications being offered in AI for human resources and in data analytics. There's a new society for data analytics that's just been formed. There's a movement that's out there that says, look, we know this is the future, but I don't care what you do in HR, you're going to have to understand the data analytics piece and you're going to have to understand the AI piece, even though it's only touching probably 1% to tie it to 10% of what you're doing right now. At some point in the not too distant future, this is going to envelop your entire HR program because that people asset needs to be studied, nurtured, developed, make sure that it's really performing at its highest level, and most importantly, is sticking around.
Let's get back to the generational side of this. And we touched on this earlier. Gen Z, a little bit different, or maybe a lot different, and they're not in leadership roles yet. Over the next 5 years or 10 years, they will be. And the millennials will be maybe top of organizations more so than they are right now. How different will that make things? I mean, what are the characteristics you think they'll be bringing into these roles?
When you talk about, again, studied generations, Gen Y, Gen Z is kind of at the top of the food chain, right? Because they're the modern ones, and everyone who is an economist or has a PhD and is studying at a university or at a McKinsey, Boston Consulting, these kinds of firms, they're writing about this. But we know that there are 5 things that they want. And survey after survey, they want career and professional development. That always comes first. You need to couch things in terms of their career and professional development. They will respond well to that. Second thing they're looking for, as I mentioned, some form of a work-life family balance or equilibrium or control. They want this idea of corporate social responsibility, environmentalism, sustainability, right? If your company is doing something to make the world a better place, you're right in sync, right in line with what Gen Z is looking for. Advertise that in your recruitment. Make sure that's on your company intranet so that people see what you're doing beyond just your business and how you make a profit, right? There are other things too. They want to work for an ethical company doing meaningful work for a management team that cares about them personally. And bingo, there you have it. So much of the connection that people have to their company is through their immediate boss, and it's an emotional connection. When you work for someone you truly love working for, you give the discretionary effort. No one's going to offer me 20% to leave and go somewhere else. I might have to leave Paul Falcone, but then and go, I'm going to deal with somebody who, spits fire and throws chairs. I'm not dealing with that. Not for 20%. After taxes, it's not going to make enough of a difference. I'm here because he's invested in me or she's invested in my well-being and is helping me with my current professional development. I feel like I can do my best work every day with peace of mind. And I'm not giving that up for any more money. And that's really where my training has always come in. I'm not training them on the data side. I'm not a data scientist. Mine is all about how do you pierce their hearts? From an interview with someone you've only known for 10 minutes, you can ask the right kind of questions in the beginning of that interview so that they'll say something like, Linda, I normally don't say this in an interview, but as soon as you can get them to reveal the real person, they're willing to make themselves vulnerable in a healthy sense. And it's that heart to heart connection that I think is really what's missing out there. And you can teach managers that it's safe to be able to do that, make yourself vulnerable in a healthy sense, put other people's needs ahead of your own, but expect them to respond in kind. And in that balance, you can really enjoy your career a lot more.
And do you think we're going to have that? Because the stories I hear are that people hate the interviews they're getting. There's a lot of weeding out electronically. There are even first interviews that don't involve a human being, right? So we don't seem to be getting closer to that.
No, but it'll bounce back. Right now, they're using the algorithms to screen resumes way too aggressively. People send in a resume, and I've seen it, where they're very qualified for a job, and within 30 minutes in their inbox is the rejection notice. Well, we know that a human being didn't look at that. Okay, that was the applicant tracking system that said, you don't have prior real estate experience, out you go, or whatever. That's too much. And that will kind of soften over time. They're going to realize they can't outsource um, your logic. You still have to have that human touch. So there'll be a balance between what humans are overseeing and what the algorithms are pulling. But right now, I think people are feeling overwhelmed and they're relying on the algorithms, probably do a little too much, but they feel like, again, they're building the plane while they're flying it. They don't have the bandwidth. Whatever the system says is right is all I'm going to deal with. When things start to settle down, they'll be able to look into it a little bit more and say, oops, I think we need to retrain our algorithm because they screened out this fella or this gal. And boy, she would be great here. Why did it screen it out? Let's take a look at those criteria we're using again. And, it's that sort of thing. So we're seeing a little bit of a backlash with the new technology, but I think that's going to soften and work itself out in the not too distant future.
Okay, so let's end with looking at the future. If you were giving advice to HR departments, or maybe to the C-suite, but certainly to HR, what are the things you tell them to be aware of right now? What kind of planning do they need to be doing? Because as you say, right now, they're just dealing with crises, right? At some point, you need to sit down and be strategic.
Yeah, and we're coming out of that pure crisis moment. I would say that was probably 2020 to late 2022, but 2020, 2023 and 24, we're kind of getting our legs back underneath us. And hopefully by 2026, we'll really be kind of back on a new normal, but it is a new normal path. And I do think, just humbly speaking, when you look at this idea of people are your most important asset, they really are. You can't just take them for granted. And they have been historically in the United States and elsewhere. It has just not been the priority. And all of a sudden, it's being forced to be the priority because, again, um, in the industrialized nations where talent scarcity is going to be the rule of the land going forward, there'll be pockets where layoffs are going to happen. There's still going to be economic cycles. But the reality is the people piece of this is probably going to be one of the most important drivers of profitability. So I do think look at data analytics, start pulling that software into your HRIS system. In human resources, those buttons are there, but you have to know how to use them, be an early adopter, be an open mind, you be the first domino, but embrace that kind of change. Understand that to the degree that you can pull AI into your various HR disciplines or funnels, whether it's recruitment or talent development or training or whatever, pull that stuff in, be an early adopter. I think that's the best career medicine you can give yourself because it is going to be very disruptive. And people who are traditional HR administrative types, that's not going to be where the future goes. CEOs are demanding more than that, and well, they should. So that really would be my best advice. Be flexible, be willing to unlearn what you already assume, and read a lot because there's so much changing out there. It's important that you stay on top of really not only where the technology is going, but where, look at the CEO surveys. They have these global CEO surveys and outlooks and the KPMG, McKinsey, that they all do. It's important to look, what are the CEOs looking for? And are you, as a business person in general, whether you're in HR or anywhere else, are you meeting those expectations? But now's the time to be informed, and keeping that information going is really critical.
Really exciting times. Paul, thanks so much for talking to me.
My pleasure, Lynn. It was really a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time.
Paul Falcone is an author and consultant.